Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Why Most COVID-19 Officer Training Sucks and What Would Be Better. This session is kindly sponsored by our platinum sponsor, that's IATSE 891. Thank you very much to IATSE 891. My name is Will Heller. I'm the Safety Advisor for Performing Arts and Live Events at Actsafe Safety Association. We first ask that everyone please mute yourselves in Remo. That's in the lobby. Just as a reminder, you are also, we want to let you know that you're muted here as well for the time being. I'm going to introduce today's panelists, starting with Kathy Day. Kathy's worked in the performing arts world for over 25 years in assorted capacities, such as audiovisual production coordinator and trainer, and has been one of Actsafe's OFA, that's Occupational First Aid Level 1 instructors, since 1998. Since the motion picture industry has ramped back up again, Kathy has devoted her working time to COVID coordination and testing with Iridia Medical. Dominic Hosio is principal of Lanky and Limey Limited. They offer strategic, creative, safety consulting, technical, production, and labor services in the US, Europe, and worldwide. Dominic's work focuses on the empowerment of individuals within organizations and how individual participation, the prevailing environment, their mental health, and a sense of agency can impact strategic safety and operational goals. And Steve is head of Adelman Law Group and vice president of the Event Safety Alliance. If you don't know Steve, you haven't been to one of our last few conferences. He's served as a keynote speaker for us in the past, as well as a presenter. He's been a general instigator in conversations. Steve, give a wave. Thanks for being a supporter of us for so long. If you have any questions that you would like to be posed to the panelists during the question time, please write them into the chat at the bottom of your screens. Without further delay, let me welcome our panelists for the session and take it away.
Thanks very much, Will. Greetings to all of you in webinar land. Thanks for sticking around. I know it's Friday afternoon. Foolishly, I did not pour myself a suitable drink. So in solidarity with those of you who are up in British Columbia, I'm drinking tea and wearing a fleece, but rest assured, where I am in Scottsdale, Arizona, it is 21 degrees Celsius, so it's quite nice out. And my doors and windows are open today, so there. The reason for this session originates from a COVID compliance officer training course that I took. I'm not going to call them out by name. That's not nice. And I know that we're dealing with a Canadian audience, so I'm going to try to be nice. I'm not going to call them out by name, but I will describe what I took and what happened. It was an online training course. It lasted just a couple of hours and cost roughly $50 US. And at the end, they promised a certificate, and I assumed that there would be a quiz. I took the quiz. I got one question wrong. I was paying attention, but I got a question wrong anyway, and I got the certificate at the end. So that's basically what happened. The way I felt about it was bored, sick, frustrated, irritated, a bunch of really pretty negative emotions. Dumb, I felt ignorant. I felt like I hadn't learned anything, certainly nothing that I didn't know before, and none of the many important things that I thought could have been, should have been, contained in a COVID compliance professional training course. So here's what the course taught, or at least ostensibly taught, which is the three things that everybody already knows to do with regard to health and safety during this pandemic, which is social distancing, face covering, hand washing. When I say that, you will notice that I don't pause. I don't take a breath. There's no dashes or spaces. It's just one run-on word: social distancing, face covering, hand washing. Usually when I say that, I go like this in the middle. I didn't learn anything other than those things, and I already knew those things before. It didn't tell me any of the things that I really cared about, which is what's the effect of the testing that's available? what is a PCR test? How do rapid tests differ, if at all? Why is it that the first time I got tested, they stuck a giant Q-tip into my brain, and now it's just a little gentle sweep 3 times in each nostril? What's the difference? How do I talk to people who have different values or perhaps watch different news media than I do? How do I talk to them and convince them to do what science suggests they ought to do to keep themselves and everybody else safe? All of these subjects were not touched on, and it made me deeply frustrated. And so I looked around and tried to take a few more, and frankly, my frustration grew. It didn't shrink, because largely what the training courses seemed to focus on was teaching me the science. And it's not that I don't care about the science, it's that I already know enough to at least step onto a work site, administer a test if someone teaches me how to do that, but it doesn't teach me any of the whys, and it definitely didn't teach me what to do if anything went sideways, if somebody actually had a positive result. I had to figure that out on my own. And I didn't like that. So that was kind of the origin story for this session. And fortunately, we have 2 people joining us who actually know stuff. So we're not going to deal with ripe speculation. If you are inclined to write in the chat in lowercase letters, because we're being polite here, hey, you smart people. Hey, Dominic. Hey, Kathy. Do you guys have a prediction when we're going to have herd immunity? Yeah, don't ask us that, because we don't know. We don't know any more than you do, in the sense that we all can read, and we should read. So this session is going to focus on things that we do know, because we have been learning and teaching and doing, and all 3 of us have been doing that. So that's really the focus as well as the background for this session. So take a deep breath. If you have wandered into this session and this doesn't sound like your cup of tea, we won't notice if you depart and go get something stronger. Come back if you want. We do think there's going to be some valuable stuff here. For the rest of you, let's go. So Dominic and Kathy, I have some questions teed up, as you know. Let's begin with, who is hired to do enforcement of COVID rules? Kathy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go over to Dominic. Kathy, you're muted. There you go.
Oh, again? Oh,
no, you're good.
Oh, okay. I'm just not talking loud enough. So thank you, Steve. So I have been predominantly working in film, doing testing for film. And so that's my basis of my point of view, my experience level as far as COVID testing goes. And so from what I have seen, there's no baseline set of qualifications that you are required to have here in BC to get into this position. It is generally, it's not anything that's posted on the IATSE site or the DGC. It's not under the umbrella of any one particular group or union or anything. So it's not like you go find a Teamster or you go find somebody that's got this training. You basically just need a warm body who can come on in. Yes, even you. And it could be you. And so the qualification or the training is whoever's hiring them feels it should be at the time. And what do they know to begin with? Usually nothing. So everybody at the beginning especially was flying off the seat of their pants and just reacting to, oh, that didn't work, or, oh, we forgot about this. There's an awful lot of that. And still, there is, as more and more productions are coming online. So as far as who's being hired, these can be people with absolutely no film or performing arts experience whatsoever, no production. They could be students, they could be people with no experience having worked ever, first job. So what their tasks can vary, and the authority that they have can vary. But a lot of the time, it's not really well defined. And once a production, if you're talking about a big production, then they've been on the ground. They'll have been on the ground for a couple of months, and they'll have finally figured it out. And they'll figure out what training should have happened, what things should have been in place. But there really was not a lot of places to go to get. What should we know? What should we teach? What does this job mean? So there really hasn't been a lot.
Dominic Hosio, you want to weigh in on any of those questions?
Oh, I couldn't possibly have an opinion. So I'm going to start by talking about something seemingly a little strange. Some of you may be aware of a small little circus company that's based on the east coast of Canada. I think they're in the French-Canadian part of Canada. They have a couple of small shows in Las Vegas. When I first arrived in the States back in '98, and I used to watch the job postings for that company, it used to say, must be able to speak fluent conversational French and written French essential. And then a couple of years later, when they started running out of French-speaking technicians, it was like, must be able to have conversational French, written French an advantage. And it got to the point where they didn't require French at all. When we first started seeing COVID safety officers, COVID compliance officers in New York, I'm not making a word of this up. They had to be a security professional with X amount of years of experience. They had to be a paramedic, and they had to have an OSHA instructor rating. Needless to say, that is no longer the case.
Wow.
And so, because essentially, just on the film and TV front, let alone any of the other types of events, there wasn't the resources available. You couldn't find people who had all of those qualifications. So, to use one of Steve's favorite terms, it depends. Right. We're seeing, as Kathy talked about, we're seeing highly qualified medical professionals, but often we're seeing those people without any entertainment industry experience. We're seeing who's ever left at an organization, and that's not a derogatory statement. That's simply a statement of the reality of the pandemic. We're seeing leaders who can't afford to hire anybody else. We're seeing anyone and everyone who's had their main source of income dry up and are trying to find new ways to pay their bills. And again, none of this is a comment on those individuals in terms of their quality. And I think Kathy hit on a really important point here. I think the key that we have to remember throughout this entire conversation when we talk about it is this is the first time that any of us, leaders, workers, parents, politicians, have been through this. And everybody is learning for the first time. Everybody is making mistakes. And that is reflected in who we are seeing in these roles.
All right, so since Dominic is clearly right that there was not a ready group of people with an extraordinarily broad range of pandemic-specific training who didn't otherwise have something to do with their time starting March of last year, essentially, there are no barriers to entry for COVID compliance enforcement work. So if there aren't such human beings, we obviously have to create them. So next logical question, I think, is what training should people have to do the work necessary to help keep people healthy on a work site during a pandemic? What training should they have?
So if I can speak to some of that, I feel that first there needs to be a division of duties. So one, well, maybe not. It depends. So there's an awful lot of compartments and responsibilities that can be broken up to different people depending on how large the production or the theater or organization is. And so if they have the budget available for different levels of people, then the baseline people, the people coming in doing the cleaning and organizing the lineups they typically don't have to have a whole lot of training, but everybody needs to have some basic understanding of film etiquette, etiquette for theater, safety, the basic safety courses, because that's not what I saw. I saw people walking underneath boom lifts and all kinds of crazy things. And so there needs to be an understanding of a very basic but important set of safety rules and etiquette. How do you deal with a cast, the lead, in an opera or something like that? And, you don't just bark at them and tell them that they have to go to the back of the line. So there's etiquette that has to be explained and understood. And that's just at a very base minimum. And then from there, individuals need, in my opinion, need to learn their role, their function, what to clean, how to clean, don't spray over here, instead use your cloth. There's lots of details on how to do that COVID cleaning, how to deal with people, and how to deal with people who are non-compliant. So there's very definitive responsibilities.
It's all about this, right? I mean, you just do a pump and you're good. Here,
you're good.
I'm ready. I'm a COVID compliance officer.
You are, yes, yeah. So I mean, what you were saying, the mask, the facial protection, and the get your hands out of your face, that kind of thing. Those are the base things that we have to understand. Everybody's coming in with that knowledge. But maybe I don't want to wear my mask because I'm in a pod with this person. So, there has to be some expertise and some understanding of, I know you're in their pod, but you're not in everybody else's pod. And there's a whole optical thing. So, pitfalls need to be taught. What do you do when you come up against something that's different? And in film, I can guarantee you every single minute of the day, there's something that we didn't plan for. Oh, that didn't happen that way. So we now have to pick up and move somewhere else and do things differently. So people have to have a level of comfort in their understanding of their authority level, what is my job title, and the responsibilities for it. So I think a clear definition, is one of the next things that has to be laid out for them coming into a new role, a job description.
There's a concept. Dominic, you actually do COVID compliance training, among other COVID-related training, without giving away your secrets and intellectual property. Give us an idea. What topics are you covering?
Well, thank you for the opportunity for a shameless plug.
Take it.
As you said at the start, right? Literally, I'm going to teach you the medical as quickly as Steve just did. Hands, face, space. Done. Right? We're talking about it. So we, as some of the courses that Steve talked about, we're talking about 2 hours, and what is 2 hours is really going to prepare you for. So we have actually divided it up into subjects, and I'll talk about the subjects. We'll get into a bit of depth of the COVID safety officer in a minute, but we do an 8-hour COVID safety officer course, and we have a requirement that you do quarterly updates because the information is changing so quickly. We have an 8-hour class that is focused on purely designing for COVID, if you're a designer or a TD or those kind of people. We got an 8-hour class focused on attending to COVID, meaning what are you going to do if you have any kind of attendees? And then we have an 8-hour class on mental health related to COVID. And then we have an executive summary for all of those people who actually make decisions and spend money and need to be told why you need to do it. But to kind of build with the subjects that we talk about, well, first of all, what we do is we take it from a risk management perspective. One of my pet peeves is everybody talks about this as if what we got to do is just do COVID. And really, COVID is the latest risk, right? We shouldn't be bolting COVID on top of what we are doing. We should be building COVID as a risk into our risk assessments. And the bottom line is that when Steve was asking what kind of people do we need to create people who can look at the world, see risks, assess them, and as Kathy said, know what to do. We cover the basics. So to not denigrate the medical stuff, there's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of confusion. Like I realized nobody had ever shown anybody I knew how to properly wash your hands for hand hygiene. Right? So you get told to wash your hands, but has anybody ever shown you how you should do it and how it's repeatable? We use the Baby Shark video, which is a hand washing song, which we use to upset people a lot if they don't remember to wash their hands, and you can guarantee they always forget. Interestingly enough, here's a prop I brought with me. These are some Baby Shark sanitizing hand wipes that you can get from various pharmacies. But we look at things like testing, and we look at the limits of testing, and we look at what it means when something says that it's X amount accurate, and what does that mean in terms of the practicalities. And that brings us on to the regulation. We look at the regulation. There's a misconception. I'm sure there's something similar going on north of the border, but I keep getting asked, what are the new OSHA requirements for COVID? There are none. They were already there in the first place. They had a whole section on infectious diseases that you had to follow. They had a whole section on respirators that you already had to follow. They had a general duty clause that says you must provide a workplace free from recognized hazards for your workers. So they provide advice in context of COVID. So we look at the regulation. We look at the equivalent of the provincial regulation, any city regulation. We look at state regulation, obviously in the States. We look at federal regulation. We look at practical ways to apply it all. And that's really the big thing, right? So it's one thing to say hands, face, space, but how do I maintain space when I'm unloading a truck? How do I not undermine my entire COVID safety protocols by having too few bathrooms and letting everybody go to the bathroom at the same time? Because this is not the same job that it used to be. And that's one of the things we focus on. We focus on the fact that you cannot call your 10 or 15 minute break for everybody at 11 o'clock like you used to. You need to encourage people to go to the bathroom when they need to go to the bathroom, so you have less people who go to the bathroom. And if you don't believe me, you do not want to know about the fecal transmission of the viruses.
You're right.
Have people having to have a COVID compliance person or safety person sat outside the bathrooms to make sure people are not getting too close. And here's a really big piece of information that most of the men have never understood before. So ladies, enjoy this for what it's worth. For the first time in human history, men finally understand what it's like to be a woman going to a festival, because we've had to close down half the bathrooms in order to maintain social distancing. And so there are giant lines outside the bathrooms. You know, how do you lower the friction for people to make it easier for them to comply? Those are some of the things we look at. And I'll close with saying the big thing that we do in our training that I think is invaluable and would be invaluable in any training that anybody created is that we go around the room in any class that we have, and we set aside about 45 minutes for the entire class to talk about their experiences for anybody who's worked during a COVID situation, what worked, what didn't work. And I can't tell you the level of information that other people get from, the students get from that, hearing their own peers talking about what they've experienced and what, there's something called the iceberg of ignorance, right? And it's generally 4% of what's going on at the front line is what senior leadership understands. And so what you want to do is reduce that iceberg. And that's one of the ways to do it. So I could go on for longer, but that's basically a précis of the kind of things we look at.
And for those of you watching in webinar land, we're actually going to discuss what Dominic just said, things that have worked, things that have not worked. We will discuss that among the three of us. And then when we open this up for Q&A, we hope that you will share at least things that have worked. Because, this is not meant to be a bitch session, but rather something constructive, because soon, God willing, we're going to get back to work if you're not already, dipping a toe in that water. So we really do want this to be constructive. And yes, I do have shtick, but also I take this stuff really seriously. So there. Let's talk about testing. Now, Kathy, you have medical training. Dominic, I know that you're probably closer to me. You read stuff really carefully and you're smart, but you are not medically trained yourself. Certainly I'm not. I'm a lawyer. So in that context, what are you guys able to say with confidence about testing, either PCR testing or rapid testing of any of the varieties that you've seen? What things can you say that are useful for people to know, since you guys have been on the front lines?
So currently we are Iridia that I'm working for, we're actually just in the final stages of becoming accredited to do our own rapid testing, antigen and PCR. And so far, and we're one of the first to apply for it, so we're almost one of the first out the gate finally, so it hasn't been allowed. We've been doing in-lab testing, so we take the tests and we deliver the PCR tests to a lab, an accredited lab, and we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people per production per day, so thousands every day we're going in. So the film industry did a really, really good job of keeping people safe and doing the testing at the prescribed regular intervals as per the Screen Actors Guild and all of the information that came out. So there's going to be a level of false negatives, false positives, of course. In our experience, we found very little. We found pretty consistent results. We did have some invalids where something happened, they had a bloody nose or they had too much mucus or something. There will always be the odd invalid. And then there will always be the person that you test and then 10 minutes later, they actually have contracted the virus, and our test results aren't coming back for, anywhere from 12 to 72 hours. So, there's pitfalls with that testing, of course. And so if in that 72-hour window, somebody has become positive, but they just got a negative result because they were negative when they got tested, there's those kind of limitations that are always going to be there and happen. But it really mitigated an awful lot of exposure. And what we did find was that the people that were coming in with positives were coming in with positives. So they weren't contracting it from the set or film, which was really positive for film. So, then there was obviously going to be the odd cases that a pod did, transmit it to each other because they were working closely and they were just not being careful. But with the amount of people that were being tested every single day and the amount of film productions that are now up and running, it's remarkably low, the amount of positives. And the test results are really showing consistent results. So we were pretty happy about that. The rapid testing is another thing that is going to be happening out there fairly soon. So we really haven't, in industry, we haven't been doing, and I mean we as Iridia, but also other organizations aren't really doing a lot of rapid testing yet, but it's coming like really imminently. We're going to be seeing that rapid testing in addition to the in-lab PCRs.
Dominic, you're just bursting.
Oh, it's so exciting. One of my favorite topics. Ask questions, right? Understand what you are trying to achieve in the context that you are trying to achieve it. The bottom line is, I want to be clear, what I'm about to say bears no reflection on Kathy and her company. There are some legitimate companies out there. There are, in the States, it's a bit more, shall we say, freewheeling. There is a bit more interesting things going on. So, you'll hear people talk about the fancy terms. I mean, Kathy mentioned it, right? We're talking about things like population prevalence, negative predictive value, positive predictive value. So what we're really talking about is what is the rate of the disease in the population, and what is the ability of the test to give you an accurate result or a false result. That's the simple version of it, right? But it's also predicated, that accuracy that Kathy was talking about is predicated on the skill of your vendor. And so you need to understand, what is your vendor's track record? Because I'm not making a word of this up. I won't reveal who they are, but I was involved with an event where they hired a testing company that was set up by a production coordinator who hired some PAs to take blood tests. And for the first 3 days, they were doing the rapid testing, and they were waiting. They were using the little thing, and they were letting people go to work when the first line had activated, which essentially was just telling you the test was working. It wasn't giving you a result, right? So obviously those people got replaced. But also understand the limits of what you're trying to do with that testing. One of the things I like to say is never underestimate people's ability to circumvent your best testing. It is not a panacea. It is a useful tool. And it is, we often talk about the Swiss cheese model, and you'll see it on the CDC website. They'll talk about different layers. The vaccine is simply another slice of cheese. So is testing. Mm-hmm. So it is not a panacea. It is a really useful tool in the hands of knowledgeable professionals. For example, maybe don't get everybody to cluster around your testing table. That would be a really good handy hint there. The other thing is, when we talk about people's ability to circumvent this stuff, again, another story. They would test, what are the testing intervals and why? So you might have a regulatory body, an AHJ, who is demanding that you test on a given basis, or there might be contractual obligations with DGA, various unions, things of that nature. That's usually reasonable recommendations, but do they work for your circumstances? Mm-hmm. Do you understand the purpose of them? Because one of the things I've seen misused with the PCR type testing, the ones that take longer, is often they're not allowing sufficient time, and people are working before they get the results, which means all you know is what was true 2 or 3 days ago. You don't know what is happening now, right? And so you've got to listen to your testers. If they tell you people can't start work until we get the results, there's a reason they're telling you that. And then the final thing that I would say is, again, when we talk about people's ability to circumvent, we were testing, we were having really good compliance with all of the strictures we put in place. 3 of the performers got COVID because backstage they were taking something I believe is legal in Canada right now, and they were passing it from person to person, and that's how the 3 of them got infected. So don't take out your calculation about human behavior just because you're testing.
Yeah. Steve, Dominic, it's 100% true. Human nature is such that it just is what it is, for sure. And so you've got your screening, which is supposed to screen out certain things. We had on one unnamed production that I was on, we had the head of the COVID department vomiting on the side of the road on their way to work. Came in anyway. Spent the entire day at work. Had to be sent home. And fortunately, it wasn't COVID. But nevertheless, our nature is to go, that's not COVID. I just have the flu. It's like, yeah, but you answered those questions and you answered them falsely. So, and that was in the beginning. And there's a lot of factors of why people make those decisions to say those things and to do those things. And yeah, 5 minutes after I take my test, even if it was a rapid test, I'm going to have this false, as I love, what you were saying, Dominic, but this false sense of, oh, good, I'm good. And so then I'll take my mask off and I'll, pass this thing around, or, go breathe your air, and, or share. It's amazing how people just naturally feel this sense of, okay, I'm good now. And you're right. It's a false sense of security.
Well, and one thing I would add that I think you could probably talk to better than I could. Another thing that everybody should be aware of, and especially listen to your testing organizations when you're dealing with it, is what happens when somebody has had COVID and you have a testing regime in place. Kathy, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, then they just get thrown back into the you're getting tested 1, 2, or 3 times a week mix. So at this point, at least from our perspective, we're not treating anybody as, okay, great, you're immune now. So you still have to prove that you're not shedding anything. And the other thing that around that piece there is, it's become such a regular part of their day or their week that it's like, I'm here for my testing. And it's just like, I'm going to go grab my coffee and I'm going to go get my test. And because we're not doing the nasal pharyngeal, the one to the back of the brain, the anterior nasal it's not unpleasant. And, and the more that we developed relationships with people, weekly we'd check in, or every twice a week, or, you'd have these check-ins with people. And so they actually enjoyed their time coming in for their test, because we finally figured out on these productions how to avoid these ridiculous lineups. How do we make it work really well and go faster and make these people not hate the experience? And so even if they had been positive once and they still have to come back, they just get it. If I'm going to be at work, I have to do this. So it's not horrible. I'll do it.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up, and that's absolutely right. I mean, certainly the way I would like to go. The only thing I will say is that there is advice in the US that we're seeing, and I don't know if it'll apply anywhere else in Canada, obviously, but OSHA, for example, and several other jurisdictions are mandating that if somebody is tested, if somebody's had the disease, that they are then taken out of the testing cycle for an X amount of time, not because they're immune, but because they're going to test positive. And so, so that's just something to consider depending on the jurisdiction you're in.
So I believe what has to happen is they do get tested once they've done their 10 days. A doctor clears them to say, yeah, you've done your 10 days. You've known from the time you were positive, you've got no more symptoms. No, I don't. So we test them before they come on site. And so, yeah, there is that. But then once they get through that process, so it's a good 14 days. And then as long as they're not shedding that virus, they're good to come back to work.
Let me just take a moment to explain something that Dominic mentioned that I hope most of you know, but it's always worth taking an inside joke and making sure that everyone is on the same page. So Dominic referred to something called the Swiss cheese theory. This is a real thing. You should look it up if you're not familiar with it. The Swiss cheese theory it's a theory of risk management. Created by a fabulously named guy. His real name is James Reason. And I'm so envious. What a great name for somebody who deals with risk and safety. Anyway, James Reason's Swiss cheese theory. Imagine a block of Swiss cheese, slice it up, rotate the slices, and then risk is like an arrow going through the holes in the sliced and rotated cheese. And the idea is Swiss cheese has a lot of holes in it. The risk may go through one hole. It may go through a second hole, but eventually, if you have enough pieces of cheese, enough means of avoiding or mitigating risk, eventually that risk is not going to go through a hole, rather it's going to find cheese. And so risk in this scenario is defeated by cheese. I personally am lactose intolerant, in reality, not so much in my analogies. So I prefer the belt and suspenders analogy, but it's the same idea. And the idea, which I think is really well taken with regard to COVID-19, is lots of measures are necessary to address the same insidious virus because none of the measures is perfect. Far from it. So, the gold standard supposedly is the PCR test, polymerase chain reaction, the one you have to get at home and it gets sent away to a lab and takes 3 days or so to get the results back. Supposedly that has the highest test validity, but not always. It also has the highest false positive rate. The rapid tests, they're great for on-site use because you get your results back, literally in a matter of minutes. And that's what you need when you've got people queued up, hopefully not queued up too closely. Again, good point, Dominic. Rapid tests are really useful, but their test validity is lower than PCR tests. You can do them more frequently because they're cheap, relatively, and you can do them more frequently because they're fast. But neither a PCR test nor any of the varieties of rapid test is foolproof. That's why asking people, have you been anywhere around someone? Have you been in close contact with someone who is either infectious or showing symptoms of infection? That question is important. And, although swiping people's forehead with a $89 US thermal scanner is, I think the legal term is not useful, crap, something like that. It's still better than nothing. It's not a lot better than nothing. It is a piece of information. Everyone's temperature baseline varies, so it's not a very useful piece of information, but it's something. And so the point is, the more risk management measures you employ in the situation of COVID-19, the more likely it is that that risk will go through a hole in a slice of cheese, maybe go through a second hole, but eventually, yay, it reaches cheese, saved by cheese. Yes, that's what we're going for here. COVID-19 has reduced us to trying to be saved by cheese, but that is our reality. By the way, and then I'll stop talking, my eyes are occasionally catching comments in the chat. And a while ago, somebody made an excellent point, which I want to bring up right now, which is we're talking about COVID-19. We're talking about enforcement of COVID risk management measures. And that's a really important conversation to have, especially right now. But it sure as hell isn't the only risk that we're going to face as we get back to work, as we reopen things. All of the old risks, all of the bad old things that existed before still exist. And, like the airline pilots a couple of months ago who said, I don't think I'm flying especially safely right now because I'm rusty. I haven't flown an airplane in a few months. We're all going to be like that too. And all the old threats are still there. So my concluding remark, and hopefully, Dominic and Kathy, I've filibustered long enough for you guys to have interesting things to say, is don't get so focused on dealing just with COVID-19 that you forget all of the other risks that remain out there. I'll tee up one and then shut up. The safest way to deal with COVID-19 from a crowd management perspective, you probably know this, is do your event outdoors if that's possible, because the air circulation is much better and coronavirus is primarily transmitted through aerosolized droplets, our breath. So more air circulation outside, great. But we all know what else is involved when you'd hold an event outside: severe weather. And so you cannot just cast aside your severe weather action plan because you are single-mindedly focused on COVID-19. All of the threats require your attention. How's that for an upbeat comment?
Actually, if I can just interrupt, there was another good question in the chat that came across, and it was posed a little bit earlier, and they were talking about activities that COVID compliance officers might be taking on aside from the testing. And I don't know if you had something to speak to that.
Sure. So in general, first of all, The biggest criteria that you have to take on board is what can the person reasonably do based upon the circumstances. Because if you've got multiple zones and people are only allowed in this zone and they're not allowed in this zone, and you've got multiple bathrooms and you've got multiple cleaning and all that stuff going on, you've got to acknowledge when something is too much. COVID compliance officers, safety officers don't have to do everything. They may supervise things, right? So there is certainly maybe a testing. There may be they may be involved with temperature checking, screening for people, right, when they come in. They may be involved in cleaning. They may be involved in making sure that people maintain distance. They may be involved in stopping work when they see something that is unsafe and figuring out a safer way to do it. They'll be involved in the planning of the COVID safety plan if it's being done right. If they're brought in on the day of show, that's a terrible, terrible position to put a COVID safety officer in. So they need to be, they need to be involved in the
next month. That'll be me.
Right. So there's a lot. I mean, I'm sure other people have other things to add, but there's a lot of different duties that will occur. Not least of which is what is the response when somebody tests positive?
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What's the response?
What is the response?
Right.
But this is where it gets really interesting. So the regulation calls for you to have an isolation space that you can take them to, right? Somewhere that you can take them to get them away from everybody else. So one of the things you have to think about from a risk management perspective is where is that space in relation to everybody else? Because if you're marching that person through the middle of everybody else to get to that space, that's not a particularly good risk management strategy. Is it easy to get medical care to them? What is your plan to transport them? One of the interesting things in the States is that the CDC very clearly states, don't send them on public transport, don't send them by Lyft or taxi. But what they don't say is what you should do, right? They don't tell you what you should do. Now, obviously, you have to call up the local health department and tell them what's going on. It's a reportable disease. You're required to do that. But what is your plan? Is it fair to stick them in with Jim in the 17-passenger van and have him drive them home? Is that a good idea? Do they have a family member that can come and pick them up? Or do they have an argument that morning? And is that an issue? So what is your protocol for cleaning? Are you going to protect people who then go and have to clean the space? How long is that space going to be out of action? All of those are considerations that are going to be dependent on your circumstances. There's certainly guidance for it. But if you're thinking about it once you arrive, we would say in the UK, you're on a sticky wicket.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's so much that we've learned about that because I think, when we first started opening up the film industry, there was definitely positive case plans in place. But then as most plans, things happened, and then you had these questions. We have a person that would be the one officially to tell this individual that their result came back positive. And so we designate all of those things. But when you get down to those kinds of details, like how do you march them out of that location, like that was definitely not part of an original plan usually, not at least one that I was aware of. I don't mean to say that never came up earlier, but it certainly was something that I noticed developing after. So so we have all of that official stuff in process, but then how do we get them offset? And then how do we contact the people that have been in their bubble, in their pod, in their working pod? And in film, that's usually what happens. Or is this somebody that was in contact with almost everybody? And how do we deal with that contact tracing? So calmly and not creating and not creating hysteria, because as soon as people got wind that there was a positive, it would explode. And so it has to be handled very, very carefully, quickly, professionally, and if things need to shut down quickly, just to take a breath and do it, then I think that that's what usually has to happen, but it's not always possible in the middle of a production. You can't just shut everything down, but you can isolate certain people pretty quickly. And then you have to figure out all of those logistics. Yeah, so
I'd love to pick up on something Kathy was saying about notification. We've had experience with multi-floor venues in New York, where a really responsible employer has been doing stuff, and they've created this system where you're talking about people on the 8th floor and somebody on the 15th floor and another group of people on the 20th floor. And when anybody gets a COVID case on any floor, they notify the entire building, which just creates a whole bunch of anxiety for people who have no business being anxious at that moment. And so never underestimate the power of good intentions to make your life harder.
For sure. And so a lot of this information would be getting out there. People would be panicking. But honestly, keep your hands out of your mouth. Wear a mask. You can go down that elevator. Yes, the baby shark. Well, maybe not that, but yeah, don't panic. Don't go home thinking that you're now exposed. Now you've got it. Because that's one of the first things when they do contact tracing. Okay, so you've been working with this individual. Tell me about that. For the last couple of days, I need you to think back. Tell me how you are working. Tell me what the risks are here, and stop panicking. And so, yeah. So that information has to be delivered very methodically and carefully, and it almost seems covert. And you need to also protect people and not look like you're doing anything covertly or secretly, but you kind of have to just handle things in a really compassionate but professional way. Yeah, it's hard. People are still panicking.
So I want to signal to Dominic and Kathy, I'd like to wrap this up at 1:30 because I see a lot of questions, many of which, they're quickly flashing across my screen, but they seem really interesting. And I know that Will is kind of curating questions. So let's start to wind down our part of this so that we can field questions and, provide answers to the things that people watching want to know. But I want to stay briefly on the subject of communication. This may be more of a US issue than in BC. Frankly, I hope it is. But do either of you guys have any pearls of wisdom about dealing with people who, for whatever reason, maybe gravity affects them differently, cannot seem to keep their face covering on correctly, or who don't seem interested in maintaining 2 meters of social distance? Do you have any way of speaking to those people that you have found to be effective or that you think would be effective?
Kathy, obviously, I'm going to have to respond to this one and then give you a chance. But the bottom line is we all know that COVID is a conspiracy by the government, and the vaccination is just simply an argument to get chips into people's bodies. But how do you deal with non-compliant people? Well, this is going to sound facetious, but it is not meant as being facetious. I'm being deadly serious. Make it fun. Make it compliance fun. Make it easy. Understand who's going to be there. Set expectations and communicate early. Thank you, Steve. It's like we practice this. Look at the kind of things that are going to inadvertently prevent people from complying. So it could be the kind of masks that you're buying, right? It could be that somebody's never been shown how to adjust the mask so that it fits more securely. Most importantly, and this is where we see the biggest non-compliance, it's because you haven't taken into account PPE fatigue and wearing masks constantly. So you have to give more breaks. You have to give people a space where they can go out and they can not wear a mask for a few minutes, or they can take a break when they need to. We were working on a gig where they were being very compliant. They had a great, robust safety policy, and they basically said no food or drink consumed within the space and it was in California, so the weather was pretty good, but it was a 15-minute walk to get out to the space where you could actually take your mask off and have a drink. Now, we all know that many stagehands actually like to get the job done and don't like repeatedly stopping. So what did those stagehands do? They didn't drink. What is one of the signs and symptoms of dehydration? Dizziness. What is one of the signs and symptoms of COVID? Having a fever and feeling dizzy. So you have to make it as easy as possible as you can for people to comply and have a code of conduct. If you have a code of conduct and you set that expectation up front, it's really much easier to address it on site because it was a condition of them being there in the first place. Some of you, I think most of you, if you're IA members, may already know this, but the IA did a really good thing right near the start of the pandemic where they made it conduct unbecoming for any union member in the US. I don't know if it's true in Canada as well, but you can be disciplined as a union member for failing to comply with COVID requirements on a union level. And so setting that very clearly sent a message. Not that anybody in our industry really needed to be sent a message because everybody wants to work, but make it fun, make it easy, communicate.
I don't have too much to add on top of what you said there, Dominic. The keeping it fun, keeping it, build those relationships. And we got the sites that I was working on, got to develop some really, really nice interpersonal relationships. And we especially focused on those people that were constantly having their masks sliding down to about there or there. I've got my mask on. No, you don't. So you develop those relationships so that it doesn't have to come to you're going to be asked to leave. Eventually, that's what would happen. And so, yeah, you can attract people, so much more to honey than you can to anything else, right? And so you try and make it as pleasant and as, come on, this is actually about keeping the rest of us safe. And we hear all that stuff and they've already heard it. But it's like, yeah, but everybody else is doing it. And at some point, we're going to have to say, you're going to need to leave. And so we're having fun here. I like you, you like me. Let's just go about our daily business. And there's lots of areas. I loved your thoughts about making it easy, having spaces. There has to be a lot of spaces for them to go really quickly so that they can go take those masks off and they can sit and have a snack, have their lunch breaks or whatever in a room with someone else who's also not wearing any PPE, or outside, even better, if it's not torrential. And so we get that freedom to feel that little bit of normalcy that we're used to and take those masks off. And it's a lot of fun going, I had no idea you looked like that. And so we'd have those fun things to look forward to. It's like, I don't actually know what you look like without a mask on. So, and so having fun with it, I think is really, really important.
Yeah. And obviously I agree with that. This actually is the fez that I wear on site when I'm doing this exact work. And the good thing about it, aside from the fact that it looks ridiculous, is it's really easy for people to spot me a mile away. And I have seen face coverings magically defy gravity upwards back over someone's nose when they see this fez bobbing through a crowd. I have had to yell at one guy. I had to threaten his employment, and that was unpleasant. And frankly, I thought it was just amazing that I had to remind someone that working these days was a privilege, and it was a privilege conditioned on following the rules. And in that instance, I had written the rules, so I knew exactly what they were, and I reminded him. And fortunately, his supervisor walked over as I was reading this defiant young man, the Riot Act, and the supervisor said, I got this. I understand. And the kid wasn't a problem after that. But again, the Swiss cheese theory at work, everything is part of the risk mitigation tools. So, testing, I've been very fortunate. I'm vaccinated. So testing, vaccines, face coverings, hand washing, your mega sized bottles of Purell, social distancing, giving people breaks. doing all of the things that constitute your personal shtick that make you an effective communicator of things that most people probably are just fine being reminded about, but there will likely in any crowd be some people who would really rather not wear their face covering when they're doing work they've done for many years a different way. Whatever it is that makes you an effective communicator these days, just know that it is as important, quite literally, as life and death. And, to make it less dramatic, it's also about our livelihoods. We don't get to work if other people refuse to follow the rules. That makes me fairly shameless about putting a giant chicken bucket on my head and walking around making sure that people wear a face covering. I'm okay with that. I don't mind looking silly so long as we can get back to work. And I hope that most of you feel the same way. So at the risk, Dominic and Kathy, of stepping over remarks that you wanted to make, let's address some questions, and then we can do our own concluding remarks as we approach top of the hour, if that's okay with you guys.
Perfect.
Great. So at this point, Will Heller, will you help us out as I remove the fez?
Sure, Will. There's been quite a lot of chat going on in interest of what the topic has been bringing forward in people's mind. So actually, the first question is, here in BC, we have a self-declaration for workers as they arrive. And how does that kind of interact with the COVID officer role as you know it, perhaps, Kathy, or anybody else wants to comment?
From my experience, everyone coming into the workspace has to answer the questions. They all know the questions. And so we get a lot of people coming up going, no, before we've even asked. And so I've got to ask the question. And they get really good at that, and they're patient. And that's usually one of the biggest lineups, just getting into the work site. And they're great. So whether people are being honest about how they're feeling, I don't know. And if anybody's ever worked in any kind of live event production or film production, the questions are excessive fatigue. Feeling any of that? Absolutely, of course, every day. I feel that because I work in production. And so anything unusual about that? No, this is normal. Great. I'm sneezing because I'm allergic. I have hay fever. So, there's a lot of questions that people are asked, and then you have to tag on anything that's unusual, and nope, everything's good. And so then we've had, the odd person come back an hour later going, I'm starting to feel this, what should I do? And it's fantastic because they're feeling this sense of responsibility, and everyone is asking the questions. Everyone's answering the questions. It's just, again, becoming this routine. And I think that's what's key. And people are so grateful for getting back into the work field. They're happy about that. So I don't know. What do you think, Dominic?
Well, yeah, I would agree with you. There's not a lot of people who are really upset to because they're getting paid again. Again, I'll give a slightly American perspective, but I think, I'm reasonably confident this would apply in similar fashion. There may be some local variations. One of the questions I saw in the chat, which was really good, was how do you ask these questions without creating privacy issues? And, the equivalent in the US is HIPAA. That's their privacy laws. And people often get themselves tied in knots and forget, and think that they're under those laws when they're not, and all sorts of stuff. The simple thing is, I'll leave it as generic as this. If you are required to ask a series of questions and a negative answer or a positive answer, depending on how you phrase the questions, means that somebody can't come to work, you do not need to know the answers to those individual questions. It is a pass-fail. Either they are good to come to work or they are not good to come to work. When you take somebody's temperature, you do not need to know what their temperature is. You just need to know that you took their temperature and it was a pass-fail. And if you put that information down, you're complying with most of the regulation that I'm aware of, and you're not creating privacy issues. The biggest one that we see people mess up is when somebody gets sick. Now, obviously, if you've got 6 people on a crew and suddenly somebody's not there, it's going to be really obvious that somebody left. But here's my recommendation. Does so-and-so have COVID? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. That's it.
Yeah, agreed. And usually the answer is, I don't know. If there is a positive case and there was a concern that you'd be contacted for contact tracing. So fortunately we were taken out of that equation because it wasn't up to us to tell people. So we could honestly say, I don't know. I don't know. But you would definitely be contacted by the CDC, the health authority, and so you'd know before me. So we didn't have to answer that.
Steve, did you have any comments you wanted to bring?
No, I think Dominic and Kathy have covered the universe on that one.
Yeah, great. And that kind of leads into the next sort of set of questions, and that's for PA, performing arts side, we've got visitors that are general public. And a lot of the context that we've been talking about has been a closed work site like a set. And so for PA side, there's a lot of there's an understanding of what the public health orders are demanding and a disconnect in understanding how that role might play out for a COVID coordinator on site and what their role might be. For example, if you identify a member of the public as having symptoms after they've arrived, any sort of idea as to how that might play out, or any comments experience-wise?
So yeah, you're right. We're dealing with closed environments in film a lot, but we are in locations where there is members of the public, and public always comes up and sources out, hey, I need help doing things or feeling ill or whatever. So I think we're always going to run into that. If in the performing arts world, if somebody in the middle, when you said that, I immediately envisioned the person in the middle of the row who's going to have to now slide into the, I feel ill and I've touched everybody on my way out. Even though we were, had a couple of seats empty between us, I still had to squeeze out. I just envisioned that. And so, again, a lot of questions around, tell me exactly about where were you? What were you doing? Did you start sneezing on people? Were you wearing a mask? So, just really calmly isolating that person, asking some really significant questions. And then, if necessary, approaching the people in the close proximity, I suppose. But it would really depend on the individual situation. At least in audiences, they're not moving around quite as much. So, you're going to have less contact with other people. But you're going to have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis without causing mayhem.
Yeah, obviously, one of the things we do when we train people is when you complete our training course, you get a little tin star and a set of leather chaps. And when anybody turns up, you obviously have the law enforcement jurisdiction to be able to kick them out. Like, that's one of the things we talk about in the class, is that you are not an enforcement official, right? You have no authority whatsoever. So as Kathy quite rightly said, you take it on a case-by-case basis. I think what you need to do is start parsing out the different types of public audiences, right? So there are going to be what you might call private public audiences. So if you're working in corporate events, you're going to have a lot more ability to interact with employees of a company. Mm-hmm. If you're doing general admission theater, that kind of stuff, then obviously your patrons are whoever shows up, right? But having a plan, even if you can't necessarily get people to do exactly what you want, also talk to your health department, talk to your local law jurisdiction, ask them what they advise, because again, that may help you shape your plan. I love personally always having EMTs or paramedics or somebody in an ambulance on standby as part of my show set, so that if I have somebody who seems a little under the weather, I got somebody who looks like a medical professional, acts like a medical professional, and knows what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And that makes my job a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add, the scope of what you can do is going to be defined by probably someone else who is higher up the food chain, who's going to say either, your scope of responsibility is for back of house production people, or production people plus artists. I don't see, at least in the States, that we're going to have much responsibility for guests, because we're not asking them to do anything other than wear face coverings and, to the best of their meager ability, maintain social distancing. But the only people that, at least in my experience, I've had any authority over at all have been people working back of house. So I would love to say there's something that we can do for compliance with regard to front of house, but I at least have not been given that authority yet. And frankly, I don't anticipate that's going to happen soon.
Great. And I noticed, thank you for your answers to that. And I noticed that Don Parman has his hand up. Don, would you like to?
Oh, who wants to hear from Don?
Probably nobody at this point, because that's almost all you ever hear about is me. One of the things I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit was that conversation about what the actual role is as defined by the employer. So the whole thing about the testing portion, in a lot of cases, I'm already seeing it in motion picture, whereas the coordinator's only responsibility with testing is to point them at the lineup and make sure they go through it. So that can change depending on the employer. I already see that happening. So that'll be something that we have to wind into what that training is going to look like. Ask the employer, what's my involvement going to be from the get-go? Because you may not want to be as involved if all of a sudden you're getting involved in an area you're not comfortable with, which is going to be a big thing that we're going to have to answer, because I know I probably wouldn't want to, and I'm pretty much a safety nerd. I don't want to jump into a situation where they're going to make me do testing and I'm like, whoa, not me. So that'll be a big part of the conversation going down the road as well. So thanks for bringing that up. That's a really important piece to what we're going to be asking our COVID coordinators to take on.
Can I just build on that for a second? Is that okay? So just to illustrate in very stark terms what Don's really talking about, we had an appalling situation in the US where the COVID compliance officer who'd taken a 2-hour course was responsible for informing people about their test results. And in one day, they had to inform 4 people that their several weeks of work was now over. And there was no mental health support provided for the COVID compliance officer. There was no mental health support provided for the people who just lost their job. And I think we have to understand that given the seriousness of the pandemic and what people have been experiencing, that's a traumatic piece of news to get when you haven't been making much money and you're figuring out how to pay the bills. And it's absolutely obscene to me that that was allowed to go forward. And so we do have to be, one of the things we focus on is what's in your lane, what is your skill set, what should you worry about, and what shouldn't you be doing, because of the damage to both you and the other parties that you're dealing with. That requires training.
Fantastic point. And actually, that was something I was going to ask about was, as COVID officer role kind of develops further down the road, how does that relationship with what their employer's expectations of that COVID plan, where Steve talked about he wrote the rules, so it was very straightforward to go and enforce them. And in my mind, I have that Swiss cheese model kind of with all these different rules he's flipping through as he sees everybody doing their activities. So I just thought that maybe there was something more to explore in that.
Well, from my experience, the safety plan, I was never a part of creating the safety plan, but I was brought on site by a company that had me very well prepared for what my role was. And so if I wanted to look at that safety plan, because it had to be posted, it was usually, quite thick and very complicated. But I knew what I needed to know to be safe. And if I didn't, there was always, a communication line where I could get information. And when strange things happened, I was always prepared for that. I was never put into a position I've never been put into a position of doing something that I wasn't prepared or trained how to do, or where I could get the questions answered. And but that isn't the same for the COVID coordinators who are coming onto certain sets. And I know that's not going to be the same for other people going into certain, theater situations as well. There's going to be situations where there's I don't quite have all the answers. I don't actually know what my authority is. And so it all boils down to this training. And I mean, I'd love to take your course, Dominic, because I'd love to know what's in it. Because there's probably a whole lot of stuff that I didn't actually know. But I know how to do my job. And so the big broader picture is huge, and it's so valuable to have that type of a program accessible and available so that people are empowered and not terrified by this COVID. This job. And so I think it's really, the training is so valuable, and keeping communication open and not letting people worry too much, and try not to encourage panic.
We'll tee up another question for us.
Actually, the questions kind of revolve around festivals and outdoors a little bit, and how that might change the landscape is kind of the way the conversation is going. I think that most of the questions have been addressed in one way or another.
All right. Scott Spidell has a hand up.
Oh, hand up now. I see that. Scott, go ahead. Just as you get your mute ready.
This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. Two quick points. I'm going to put my headphones on so it's not so echoey. Sorry, I'm still live?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Quick point about patrons in a theater. Our box office system requires phone numbers during the bookings. So we do have a contact method in the system already, at least, which does help us that way. Even for walk-ups, they need to provide that information. So that helps us. And just going back to another part of the story, I teach theater production, which means that students are expecting to build theater and get graded on building shows. We just closed a show a week and a half ago to audiences of the students who weren't on running crew and other instructors, because that was their people that they were contained with and have been all along. We've also split our classes up into cohorts, into smaller groups that never the twain should meet to a certain extent as well, and it did work fairly well. Last December, I did have a student come down with a positive test, and I informed all the students in that crew and all the people who would have crossed over with. Many just self-isolated, half of them got tested, and no spreading. We had issues with the performance side where almost a good chunk of the students shared. Again,
shared like Dominic was showing?
No, just sharing COVID. And that was our health and provincial health authority came by and looked at all the protocols we'd followed, and it was because they were hanging out after and at homes and other places afterwards.
Yeah.
So our internal processes were working just fine. Nobody else. It's been great, but boy, has it been a struggle.
Oh yeah. Well, we never promised that any of the things that we were saying would be easy. And, I hope that, one of our takeaway points from this conversation is there are landmines and trapdoors everywhere. And that's why it's so important to have multiple means of mitigating the risk, because coronavirus is insidious.
Mm-hmm.
And like Dominic was saying, we've had all of the rules all the time. It's absolutely true. And I keep pointing that to people. And it's frustrating that we've always had the safety to solve these questions. And sorry, I'll shut up now.
I have to say, I admire you for working at a college. I just can't, because there's too much hope and too much potential. It's just too much to deal with.
Let me respond to that real quick, actually. My students who were present last year when the rug got pulled out in March are really pissed off because they're no longer getting what we promised them. My first year students coming in who left mostly high schools badly because the high schools all failed, I think, in delivering, are excited as all get out because we're actually teaching them and they see what they're getting. So I've got two different attitudes from two different years of students. Ones who think that I suck and I'm an asshole. I mean, they're not wrong. And the whole bunch of new kids are going, wow, this is great. We are actually learning. I get what's going on. So yeah, it's a lousy situation to be in right now for teaching as well.
Well, let's end this on a positive note. So Dominic and Kathy, this is going to be your clue. I'm buying you a moment to remember, oh yeah, Steve told us he was going to ask us to rap on something positive. So, here I'm saying words right now, buying you a moment to think about something positive that you want to leave our audience with. So Kathy Day, let's start with you. Something positive to leave our gentle viewers with as they depart on a Friday afternoon.
All right. Well, thanks. Stay the course. Do what we're doing. These variants, all these weird things that are coming up that are scarier than the first versions. Keep your masks on, wash your hands, keep your hands out of your mouth, distance. That is how you're going to get through this. And you're going to do the best you can. We're seeing that light at the end of the tunnel. We're not there. And we're going to have to do these masks for a while and all of those things. But we're going in the right direction. And we can't control those that decide not to do those things, those students outside of class, or all those people, because that's human nature. So you do what you're doing. Keep it up. It's going to be all right.
Dominic Hosio, something positive.
We're all screwed. Run for the hills.
Try again.
I'll try again. Deep breath. This is going to sound a little hokey, but I mean every word of it, right? So we have some of the most creative minds of any workspace or industry that you might come across, right? And by creative, I mean creative problem solvers. So leverage your teams as part of the solution. The more you empower your teams, the better your plan will be. Focus on what is within what we call your locus of control. Start planning now. Even if you don't have anything on your plate, start planning now, because you don't focus on the things you don't have any control over. You don't have control over the virus. You don't have control over public health. You don't have control over the government and whatever they're doing. But you do have control of building a framework of how you're going to respond when you're allowed to respond. And if you wait until you're able to respond, meaning if you wait until they say go, you're going to be competing with everybody else who did that, right? Mm-hmm. So decide what the right and reasonable conditions are for your circumstances. Don't wait. They may not be the same as the government's, depending on your circumstances. But if I was to give you one last thought, it would be, above all, be honest. Trust your teams, trust your stakeholders, tell them early and often. If you don't know, tell them you don't know, and tell them why you don't know. And don't delay and allow time for people to set their own expectations, because that's where things get difficult. You do have a lot of stuff within your control. You can be ready, and you can make an enormous difference for when you are allowed to do the things that you want to do.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Kathy. I'll add a positive thought on my own, which is we are blessed with lots of smart friends. Again, this stuff is hard, but it's a lot easier when you when you work together. You've all heard the line, we're all in this together, and it does get to be trite, but there's a lot of truth to it. And so as we navigate, this latest turn in the road, the turn towards reopening, talk to your smart friends, puzzle things out together. You're more likely to reach a result that makes some sense because you won't see all the trapdoors and pitfalls, but somebody else helping you think things through, they may be able to. So in this instance, I am blessed by smart friends, Kathy Day, Dominic Hosio, Will Heller, thanks very much. Of course, Don Parman, all of the good folks at Actsafe. Thanks very much, everyone. We appreciate you sticking around on a Friday afternoon.
Great, and I want to thank all of our panelists, Steve, Kathy, and Dominic. What a fantastic conversation, understanding what's happening and where we're moving forward through that as well, regarding COVID training, how we can make it better. I want to thank also IATSE 891 for sponsoring this sessions. Thanks very much, everybody.